Please join me in welcoming Bob Kolaski.
Thank you, and I promise I won't speak too quickly because I'm in a hurry. But I appreciate your willingness to listen to me while you're having lunch, and I hope I can give you a little update of where we are, and we can talk a little bit about the implications and get your reaction to some of the national policy changes that are going on and the evolution. So I appreciate the opportunity being here. I'd like to start with a question. How many of you know that today is the first day of Infrastructure, Security, and Resilience Month? How many of you have plans with your children to do something for national critical infrastructure? They are the future, and the infrastructure needs to be there for the future. So I appreciate you thinking about what you can do to make our infrastructure more secure and resilient over the next month. So I'll start with the declaration that the President issued at the start of the month. We must continue to strengthen our resilience to threats from all hazards, including terrorism and natural disasters, as well as cyber attacks. We must ensure that the federal government works with all critical infrastructure partners, including owners and operators, to share information effectively while jointly collaborating before, during, and after an incident. This includes working with infrastructure sectors to harden their assets against extreme weather and other impacts of climate change. Emerging and evolving threats require the engagement of our entire nation, from all levels of government to the private sector and the American people. So this, like a lot of what we're doing, is something that we're in together. It's something that we as the federal government come to you and the community as a whole very much as partners and in a supporting role often to the things that we do to make the infrastructure more secure and resilient. So I want to just start with that tenor that this is really something that, it's a complex environment that we operate in. It takes partnerships. Meetings such as this are really important to achieve that. In addition to the, let's see, do these slides work? In addition to the actual declaration, which is largely a public affairs aspect of November as Critical Infrastructure Security and Resilience Month, the President in the Obama administration has taken a couple of concrete steps at a policy level this year, which we've been working on since February of this year, to make progress on critical infrastructure security and resilience. In February of this year, on the same date, the President issued PPD 21, Presidential Policy Directive 21, Critical Infrastructure Security and Resilience, which subsumed and succeeded HSPD 7, the old Presidential Policy on Critical Infrastructure Protection from the Bush era, and also Executive Order 13636, which focuses on cybersecurity for critical infrastructure. Those two policies were issued on the same day concurrently, and the implementation activities associated with both of those documents have been done in an integrated fashion across the critical infrastructure community and within the federal government. The reason I emphasize that is it was very much a policy decision to integrate and connect the risks that we face, that our nation's critical infrastructure faces from physical events, whether they be terrorism or weather instances or other things, as well as from cyber events. It's really important, we view, to think about the risks to the nation's critical infrastructure from an integrated enterprise level manner. As we work with critical infrastructure owners and operators, we hear often that they're making trade-off decisions about investments related to security and resilience, whether it's against a cyber attack or against some sort of man-made harm or natural disaster. They're making those investments and they're making those decisions within the context of trading off with each other. They're taking an enterprise risk management approach. It makes no sense to separate the security approach for cybersecurity from other security approaches. And we're increasingly hearing that and working toward that, and we're trying to match that within the federal government. Folks like the Department of Energy, have continued to integrate their approach to the cybersecurity and physical security. We certainly are doing that at the Department of Homeland Security. So that's what I'm here to talk about, really, some of the steps we've taken since February. And in particular, I want to highlight two of the key documents that we were asked to work on across the community within the government and with our private sector partners, as well as our state and local partners and academic partners. And that's the update to the National Infrastructure Protection Plan to produce a successor to the NIP, as well as the development of a cybersecurity framework that is meant to be used and adopted by critical infrastructure owners and operators to raise the level of cybersecurity across the critical infrastructure community. The cybersecurity framework the development of that is being done in partnership with industry and is being led by the Department of Commerce's National Institute of Standards and Technology. DHS has a very important supporting role in that, and we will be standing up a program and continuing to evolve our information sharing mechanisms to support adoption of the framework. I'll talk a little bit about that, but I was going to start by really giving you an update of where we are in terms of national policy and how we are implementing that related to the new NIP, which I'll talk about in a second. So I'll skip it. So NIP 2013, we are in the final stages of getting this document cleared, and we expect the Secretary of Homeland Security to issue it in December of this year. We're working with our partners. We've had a very robust communications over the last 8 or 9 months across the critical infrastructure community with owners and operators and state officials across the federal government to develop this plan, and I want to give you a preview of some of what we're doing. Note the title, Partnering for Critical Infrastructure Security and Resilience. Again, I can't say it enough, partnership, working together, understanding the competitive advantages, the information advantages, the incentives, the decision-making processes of owners and operators, how we work together, what the government can do to support those decisions, the skills and expertise that the private sector brings to bear, and understanding how systems like the fuel system work in the decisions that need to be made to make sure that they're secure and resilient. That's a very important concept. So too are the concepts of security and resilience. As you can tell, those have replaced at the policy level, and those have replaced the concept of infrastructure protection. That's because we continue to evolve, that we think the end state goal of what we're trying to achieve with infrastructure is not just to keep it protected, but to keep it working. And when it doesn't work, to get it back up as fast as possible, understand the dependencies and interdependencies associated with failure of infrastructure, how best to make process in getting it up as soon as possible, bring knowledge to bear, work together to do that, remove barriers that prevent infrastructure from working, whether they be risk barriers or regulatory barriers. So the end state goal is both security, keeping people safe while they're using our infrastructure, and resilience, making sure that the infrastructure works to the extent possible, and when it doesn't work, that it's back up online as soon as possible. This policy obviously was written and shaped very much in the context of Superstorm Sandy and the events of last year, which all of you know very well, and some of the lessons that we learned in terms of how best in the interconnectedness of the infrastructure, how best to work together to get all the right people in the room together to solve complex problems like why a fuel system isn't working in New York and New Jersey. That's as complex a problem as you'll see within the government. It takes the ability to have done some pre-coordination, the ability to share information, get decision makers together, get decision makers involved, quickly break down a problem. The more we do that in advance of incidents, the quicker we can restore services during incidents. So the purpose of the plan is to guide the national efforts to strengthen the security and resilience of critical infrastructure, and the challenge is to make sure that as we develop a national plan, this is not a federal plan. As we develop a national plan, it's done in a collaborative manner. The owners and operators and our partners recognize their role in this and how we work together, and to make sure that the plan doesn't suggest that there's a sort of a hierarchy to how we work in infrastructure issues, because that's not the case. This is very much a networked issue where it's a matter of networks and systems of how infrastructure work, as well as networks and systems of decision-making and processes. The guiding principles of the plan, I've talked about partnerships. It needs to be built on the successful work that we've done in partnerships since, going all the way back to the Clinton era and PDD, Presidential Declaration 63 on critical infrastructure, and HSPD 7 on critical infrastructure protection, which really, what we did through HSPD 7, among other things, in the initial NIP was we stood up an assortment of coordinating mechanisms. Some of you are familiar, obviously, with the sector coordinating councils and the role of the sector-specific agencies. The Department of Energy is the sector-specific agency for energy. We define those roles. We work together to strengthen ties at the sector level. We've set up cross-sector structures, whether private sector, cross-sector coordinating structures such as the Partnership for Critical Infrastructure Security, which plays the role of the Critical Infrastructure Sector Coordinating Council. There have been information sharing and analysis centers that have been established, ISACs. We've got a mechanism to engage with state and local governments, and we've got a mechanism to engage with regional governments. We've got the structures in place. We've also taken advantage of some of the legal protections given to us in the Homeland Security Act so that we can work on solutions together. We can share information in a way that it doesn't impede on being, avoids antitrust issues in sharing competitive information, and it allows owners and operators of critical infrastructure to share information about security vulnerabilities and to brainstorm about risk management without having to worry about that information getting out inappropriately. So there are a lot of information protections and collaboration protections that have been put in place. Those are great. Those have demonstrated that they can work to solve problems. They don't always work, but they're certainly a foundation to build off of, and the new plan does not change those structures, but continues to call for using those structures to work together and make progress. In the NIP, we also described some of the changes in the environment since 2009. A lot of those are related to the use of information and communications technology in the critical infrastructure industries, and whether it be SCADA systems or others, and sort of cloud computing and other things. And the fact that as we continue to sort of exponentially escalate the importance of ICT to the operations of critical infrastructure, that introduces a threat vector that is also increasing, unfortunately, and adversaries who are looking to take advantage of the threat vector, and that is obviously through cyberspace and cybersecurity incidents. Those things have changed. The risk picture in cyber has changed since 2009. So too have we seen changes, continued changes. I mean, 4 years is a small period of time, but weather patterns and extreme weather, obviously you're aware of some of the data there and the proliferation of extreme weather incidents and sort of the scope of some of the extreme weather incidents. So we've got a plan that's meant to address all those hazards in a coordinated, collective way. So evolving from the 2009 NIP, I've talked a little bit about some of the change in the risk landscape in the infrastructure operations. We're operating in a place where it seems certainly, and I think you can probably find the studies, that the infrastructure is more dependent and interdependent on one another, the infrastructure sectors. As I said, talking about the changes in information communications technologies and the cyber risks associated with that. Infrastructure continues to age, just like all of us continue to age, and so infrastructure is 4 years older than it was, but there's still a matter of, are we going to make those infrastructure investments jointly across the infrastructure sector so that infrastructure is resilient? Some of these systems certainly have been designed, were designed in different environments. There are systems, water systems, for example, that are operating past their design intent life cycle, and so as those investments are made on updating infrastructure, making it more resilient, making sure that considerations on how to do that smart, thinking about the future risk environment are brought to bear in those decision processes. But those investments are going to be made, but they're not going to be made perhaps as much as some of us would hope they were because of the resource constraints in the current budget environment we operate in. So we're trying to reflect that in the new NIP. We're also reflecting some of the changes in national level policy, most prominently the work that the administration had done on Presidential Policy Directive 8, national preparedness, which is really a policy for the federal government to work in partnership with communities to enhance community preparedness, state and local preparedness, to build core capabilities and understand core capabilities and how prepared we are as a country. The NIP also is a more strategic, flexible document. Those are loaded words sometimes, but I'll say more succinctly. It's a shorter document. It has a lot less information about federal programs and gobbledygook of acronyms and things like that. We tried to get to the essence of what a plan is, put down some basic mission, vision, some goals, which I'll talk about in a second, and some specific calls to action to make progress collectively at managing risk to our nation's critical infrastructure. The plan retains a focus on risk management. You see a slightly updated version of the old National Infrastructure Protection Plan risk management framework, emphasizes the integrated nature of managing risks, the need to understand critical infrastructure, assess risks, take decisions to manage those risks, and understand the effectiveness of that. And underpinning all of that is the ability to share information. Sharing information, as you all know, is not just a matter of having the information and sending it out. You have to set up processes, you have to set up technologies, you have to overcome legal barriers, you have to build trusted relationships for effective information sharing. So one of the things that the NIP calls for, the new NIP calls for, is making progress in those areas. The goals of the national effort that the national plan is intended to address, to assess and analyze threats to, vulnerabilities of, and consequences to critical infrastructure, to inform risk management activities. So very much continue the assessment, our ability to understand the way systems work and things that threaten those systems. Secure critical infrastructure through sustainable efforts to reduce risk while accounting for the costs and benefits of security investments. This can't be an unfunded mandate. This can't be an expectation, a wishful thinking that businesses are going to pour more money than they have into securing critical infrastructure, or that state and local communities are, or the federal government are. All these decisions are made in the context of, does it bring value to the bottom line and the purposes of the bottom line, whether it be a business bottom line or whether it be a government bottom line. It's not always easy to figure that out in terms of security and resilience. We aren't as good as we should be with that. Some of these industries are regulated, some are price regulated, but so there needs to be some justification around decisions, even in non-regulated industries in a voluntary context. Owners and operators of critical infrastructure are certainly accountable to shareholders and board members and things like that. The more that we can come up with a language and continue to emphasize the idea that these investments make sense, security and resilience are important efforts, the better we will achieve collectively at raising the level of security and resilience. To enhance critical infrastructure resilience by minimizing the adverse consequences of incidents, advanced planning and mitigation, and use effective resources to save lives and assure the rapid recovery of essential services. Again, a goal. Either infrastructure keeps working and essential services are delivered, or infrastructure's not working but essential services are coming from another place, or infrastructures aren't working, essential services aren't delivering, but we know how to bounce back. That's the way we're thinking about this. How quickly can we bounce back? How can we make sure that the American people and communities get the services they need, whether it be fuel or others? Effectively share actionable and relevant information across the critical infrastructure community. I've talked about that. We as the government want to strive to do a better job of getting information out there, including information about cyber threats. But we as the government recognize that a lot of the times that information is owned by the owners and operators. They're the people who are seeing the cyber risk on their systems. They're the people who are seeing illicit activity of other forms. And how do we build the trust so that private industry, other owners and operators know that it makes sense to share information with the government and that the government will treat that information with protection. The government, us as a whole, can sort of aggregate that and get information out there so that there's value in that information. That's something we're striving to. Finally, promote learning and adaptation during and after exercises and incidents. We have put a lot of energy into trying to learn the lessons of Sandy. As an example, there's a lot that's been published. The administration did some work at the federal level, obviously in New York and New Jersey. There's been a lot of studies about that. That's great. That's a culture that needs to continue to expand. It can't just happen in these 5-year storms. It has to happen in smaller incidents, and we have to continue to learn and adapt based on what we see. A few more things to hit on with the NIP. I think I've talked a lot about this. So I'm going to assume that a lot of you aren't that familiar with the previous National Infrastructure Protection Plan. I'm sure some of you have read it. Before I took this job, I had read it several times, and I wouldn't say I was familiar with it. So we need to create plans that people can read and understand what we're talking about. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the changes and evolutions from the NIP. Just suffice that a lot of the themes that I've already hit on are caught in the new plan, and as it comes released, we will be talking about some of these changes and the implications. One of the ideas within the new NIP is not to as I said, it's not a hierarchical plan. It's not going to provide a lot of specific details of how fuel owners and operators work with the government and regional partnerships and other consortiums to make decisions on making fuel systems more secure and resilient. Instead, it's going to talk at a higher level, and there's work that needs to be done through the sector coordinating councils, other coordinating structures working with the Department of Energy, EIA, others, to figure out how to make progress in particular infrastructure systems. The point of the NIP is not to tell you how to solve your problems or how to build security and resilience in your systems. It's to give general guidance and encourage and inspire solutions to be developed. So I'm going to shift from there quickly to give you a few minutes on the cybersecurity framework, which is, as I said, is currently under development by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, working with industry. So the cybersecurity framework itself is intended. So if the NIP is a national plan to implement policy that brings us all together to execute toward progress, the cybersecurity framework is something that's been developed in collaboration, but the framework itself is for owners and operators of critical infrastructure. So it is a framework that's been intended to be adopted by businesses, entities, state governments, others, maybe within the federal government, to raise the level of cybersecurity. The cybersecurity framework right now, the draft is out for public comment. There was a recent Federal Register notice. It is available on this website. The open comment period is for 45 days. On behalf of my friends at NIST, I would just urge all of you to take a look or check with your associations or your partnerships and ask if they're going to make comments on the framework. It's very important that we get feedback at the stage. We're particularly looking for feedback on people who have tested some of the concepts within the cybersecurity framework. Do they make sense for individual businesses, individual entities, et cetera? The framework itself, the President in his executive order asked that the framework incorporate voluntary consensus standards, industry best practice. It is not, the framework is not a standard. It refers to voluntary consensus standards. It suggests some standards that will help make progress in some of the key functions of securing critical infrastructure cyber systems, but it is not intended as a standard. The framework has the following characteristics. It's cross-sector, flexible, repeatable, performance-based, cost-effective. I can tell you in my experience of working when an executive order or the president tells you to do a bunch of these words, they all look good on paper. It's really hard to do a bunch of things that are not always consistent with each other in different names, and people have different interpretations of what all these words mean. And so when you're given things like, make it cost-effective, performance-based, you really have to struggle how to do that, make it flexible, make it useful for everyone. You have to struggle for how you do that, and that's one of the things that we've really been working hard with industry to do. The framework also has to be cognizant of needs for business confidentiality, individual privacy, individual civil liberties, and so that's a key aspect of it, and be developed with awareness of the threat and vulnerability and the changing threat and vulnerability landscape of the nation's cyber system. At DHS, we've made a lot of progress working with critical infrastructure owners, operators, getting cyber threat information in, understanding the state of cyber systems and potential vulnerabilities, and we're trying to feed that, the aggregated information that we've been able to put together and feed that in to make the framework more robust as the risk environment changes. So shifting from there onto the framework itself, as I said, it's been developed in collaboration with industry. It's really intended to support risk management decision-making within cybersecurity. It's not a risk management process, but it allows trade-offs at the risk management level. It supports the improvement of cybersecurity for the nation's critical infrastructure using industry best practices and referring to standards, a lot of which are international, and provides a common mechanism for organizations to describe where they are in cybersecurity, develop a target state where they want to be in cybersecurity, and then use that to identify and prioritize opportunities for managing risk to cybersecurity and assessing progress. It's also, one of the things we've talked about it is really a template to have those sort of board-level conversations, to have those business conversations between between a provider and a supplier, or a supplier and a consumer in this case, to have conversations with the insurance industry so that you can have a common template of where you are as a business, as an entity in terms of cybersecurity and where you want to be. It's composed of 3 parts, a core, some implementation tiers, and profiles. This slide talks a little bit about those. You'll see, again, it's, anyone who's ever done any consulting work understands the as-is, to-be states and where you want to go within there, and gives you a process to make those decisions. Hopefully it's, for those of you who have a chance or have looked at it, you'll see it's fairly succinct and easy to make your way through. Hopefully it's easy to apply, and hopefully it makes sense. That's what we're continuing to learn from. It also talks about, which standards and which processes will get you to a higher level of progress against the 5 core functions within the framework, whether those be, as you'll see, that what they are is identify. So identify your cybersecurity systems, your cybersecurity risks, protect those systems, detect threats to those systems in a dynamic manner, detect attacks, and respond and recover. Those are the core focuses of cybersecurity. The framework is intended to give businesses and other critical infrastructure owners and operators a way to make progress against those areas. To support the framework, DHS and the rest of the departments and agencies within the federal government are working on some national performance goals that are very much consistent with the goals of the overall NEP that I laid out with you, establishing a voluntary program to work with partners to promote adoption and to incentivize adoption of the cybersecurity framework, and study what incentives the government has available, what incentives are available in the marketplace, which would promote adoption of the framework and ultimately adoption of higher cybersecurity practices. We've done a little work looking at what incentives are there. So let me end with just giving you a highlight of some of our early analysis. Working with the Department of Treasury and the Department of Commerce, we've talked about areas where the government can work to either do stuff directly within the government to promote adoption or incentivize adoption of the framework, or better, can help do things to allow the market to work more quickly to understand the value of these investments. I like to say that the best incentives are market-based, and a lot of what the government can do is get out of the way and let these incentives take off. Creating common templates and common practices may help do that, but then we have to get out of the way a little bit, including, perhaps reducing some regulatory burden. So some of the incentives we've looked at, cybersecurity insurance, again, that's principally a private market issue, but there's things the government can do to spur that private market. Grants, process preferences, those tend to be things that the federal government does. We give grants. We can put some conditionality on grants with the encouragement of adoption of the cybersecurity framework. Process preferences, such as technical assistance, process preferences. And then there are things that really do take actions that can't be taken in a unitary way by the federal government. Liability limitation. I mean, clearly, that's an incentive that is valued to a lot of infrastructure owners and operators. If you can demonstrate that you've done smart things in cybersecurity, perhaps there should be limits on liability if something goes wrong. For that to happen, that would take some legislative changes, but our analysis of what incentives have worked for other security things in the past demonstrate that there's some value there. Streamlining regulations, particularly in this case, streamlining information security regulations, so that if you live in a regulated industry, whether you're regulated in Sarbanes-Oxley or Gramm-Leach-Bliley or other things, and you have information security regulations already, why can't the cybersecurity framework meet your compliance needs for those, and those of you who, you're in the energy industry but not the electricity, they're NERC regulations as well. So looking at ways we can streamline regulations to reduce audit burdens and compliance cost, public recognition for being good cyber citizens, or good cyber businesses, rate recovery for price-regulated industries, really talking about are there ways to make sure that regulatory boards and others understand that investments in cybersecurity are good, prudent investments, and finally, incentives around cybersecurity research. So we hope and have tried very hard. I probably haven't used the word voluntary as much as I should in a talk like this. We've tried very hard to think of all of this work in the voluntary context, understanding that there are regulated industries involved. But the best way to achieve infrastructure security and resilience is partnership, and the best partnerships are voluntary, where there's value brought to bear on both sides. The incentives is an opportunity to use what the government can bring to bear to promote that value while doing it in a voluntary manner, and we very much are committed to exploring that path. So with that, I wanted to give you a highlight of two of the most significant things that we're doing on behalf of the President for the PPD and the EO, and we'll be talking about this throughout Critical Infrastructure Security and Resilience Month. There's a lot that can be done. Again, it's people in rooms like this who actually, have more influence on securing and making infrastructure more resilient. And so I urge you, as you continue to think about all the things that you think about, that this should be a priority. How to make sure that fuel gets delivered to consumers. I know it is a priority. We are here to support the best possible, and we hope we can do some things to support. But very much it's over to you to figure out how best to do that in the fuel system. So happy to take some questions.
Thank you. An excellent presentation. I did have one question. You focused almost exclusively on physical and cybersecurity threats. And I was wondering if you could just take a moment to talk about how this effort addresses the threats from climate change and the vulnerabilities to the infrastructure.
Sure. So we tend to think about climate change within DHS at the adaptation stage at this point. That, we can get in a debate over the source of things that are changing, but there's enough changing in terms of extreme weather and conditions, sea level rise and things like that, that it's worth considering adaptation for that. We think what we'd like to do through, consistent with the national infrastructure policy, is to continue to advocate for planning based on allowing for some uncertainty. So planning should not be based on past historical records. It should be based on future possibilities, nor should be based on one single future possibility. None of us should be so certain that we can predict the future, but we should be humble about that. But we should allow for future planning. We should do joint analysis. It allows us to work across the government to bring some of that joint analysis to bear. And then, the other things we're looking at about as they're related to climate change is, okay, so let's plan for uncertainty, let's build for something, let's work on ways to building for something that looks like a reasonable worst case, as opposed to let's hope that, climate change doesn't happen, let's cross our fingers and hope that there are no impacts. Let's allow, I live in a contingency world, let's allow for the contingencies that can happen, and then let's work with industry and state and local regulators, state and local governments to understand the barriers to thinking about building and making decisions based on some of that uncertainty. And I think the national policy and the way we talk about it gives us some of the mechanisms to do that. There are rational reasons that people accept a lot of risk and accept uncertainty. There will always be rational reasons, but when this allows us to better understand the risk and when it's being accepted and think of other ways to manage that risk. So that's some of what we're talking about. I mean, there are specific things like specific infrastructure is vulnerable to specific weather changes or sea level rise that may come from that. But that's more, as I said, at the sort of sector level. Overall, it's planning for a sort of more uncertain environment and trying to break down burdens so that we aren't taking on too much risk.
Could you just comment briefly on the next steps and once the NIP has been adopted,
Yes.
then we move into the development of the sector-specific plans next year?
Sure. So the NIP has 12 specific areas for calls to action, including joint priority setting and future planning, making progress on risk management capabilities, and adapting, measuring performance, and adapting and learning lessons. As Jeff was just referencing, one of the things that we will ask is that each sector does their own sector-specific plan, takes a look at the national policies, the new national plan, some of the priorities, and comes together to set their own priorities within the sector. Some of the common priorities that we've seen are better understanding interdependencies and dependencies, making progress in information sharing mechanisms, better aligning technical assistance efforts like that. We talk about those as a general national calls to action, but want each sectors to sort of come together and say, okay, what things do we really need to work on collectively in this sector to do a better job of managing risk and building resiliency? So those are some of the next steps. Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate it.